She was a young girl struggling at the bottom of society, working as a servant in the household of a duchess in London's West End to survive. But today was an unexpected day. As she was serving tea to her mistress, she was directly dragged to the woman's side. Mary had no idea what was happening. She tried to break free from the woman's grip, but unexpectedly, the Duchess pressed her hand against Mary's chest. Perhaps it was because her husband had died too early. This lonely woman had developed indescribable thoughts. Not only that, before Mary could react, the woman forcefully tore open her clothes. This series of actions was too much for the naive girl to bear. Frightened, Mary fled the scene, and this sudden incident cost her her first job. Fortunately, Mary was young and beautiful, and with experience as a maid. She quickly found another job in the household of another wealthy family, but reality was completely beyond her expectations. Her new master had a handsome son who loved reading literary books, exactly the kind of partner Mary had dreamed of. The boy asked Mary if she could read, and Mary said she could try. Without hesitation, Mary sat down next to the boy. Her unpolished literacy skills made the young master laugh heartily. As they communicated further, it was inevitable that youthful stirrings would arise in their hearts. But unexpectedly, the cheerful conversation inside the room was overheard by the mistress outside. The mistress seemed to sense something. She was about to open the door to stop the two from being alone, but at the last moment, she chose to give up and left with a perturbed heart. Little did she know that their reading session had long since turned into activities on the bed. In the days that followed, Mary grew accustomed to the work here, but every time the young master came home, the moment the doorbell rang, she would rush to the second floor, ignoring the mistress's calls, like a girl who had lost her soul. Then, the two young people couldn't wait to get all lovey-dovey, even though the mistress discovered their secret outside the door. Seeing her son so happy with the maid, she didn't interfere. She seemed to tacitly approve of their further actions. But Mary was not just a girl who relied on her looks. She could skillfully use an abacus, calculating the prices of the items she bought with precision, leaving even the merchants stunned. However, such a talented girl could hardly go unnoticed by passers-by. A well-dressed gentleman took the initiative to strike up a conversation with Mary, but just as they were chatting, the mistress, who was out shopping, saw them. The man was impressed by Mary's ability to calculate the prices of the purchased goods accurately in no time, and he kindly offered to walk her home. But in truth, Mary was still too young. She was attracted by the man's appearance at their first meeting, and even wanted to take things further in the employer's laundry room. Who would have thought that at this critical moment, the mistress suddenly opened the door, and everything was completely within her sight. The man was so frightened that he quickly left. But what would become of Mary's fate? As expected, the girl was kicked out on the spot. This was the price she paid for being swept away by passion. She had no one to blame but herself. And so Mary wandered the busy streets of London, finding a rented inn to stay in temporarily. During a chat with the landlady, it emerged that Mary's mother had died when she was 9. Her father had abandoned her, leaving her with no savings, only an old abacus. But the landlady thought an abacus couldn't be eaten, and that Mary should find a job quickly to avoid being unable to pay the rent in the future. So, relying on her proficiency with the abacus, Mary was eager to find an accounting job locally. However, there were too many competitors at the factory gate, and she was the only girl, which caught the boss's special attention. At the same time, Mary was very eager for the job that was within her reach. She kept explaining her unique calculation methods to the boss, who gave her a test on the spot. If she could calculate accurately, he would make an exception and let a woman take the accounting job. This made the male competitors at the scene very dissatisfied, thinking Mary was a fraud. But the boss still decided to give her a chance. But to everyone's astonishment, the girl worked out the boss's problem accurately in a short time. As a result, Mary got the job, breaking the norm for women in accounting there. The boss agreed to let her start work early the next morning. In that social context, it was very difficult for a girl to find a job, especially an accounting job that many people were competing for. Therefore, Mary wanted to buy some fruits on the street to celebrate. But unexpectedly, the group of men came around and even dragged the poor Mary into an alley. Then they pressed her to the ground, taking revenge on the woman who had taken their job opportunity. What was even more heinous was that, in order to crush Mary's ability with the abacus, these thugs stomped on her hands wildly, trying to make her completely lose her ability to survive. However, the sound of her tragic wailing drew the factory boss out. When the old man found the dying Mary in the alley, her hands, those that had changed her fate, were covered in blood and flesh. All the boss could do was send Mary to the hospital. Nothing more. A month later, The poor Mary could no longer skillfully use the abacus. Her misfortune also failed to win the landlady's sympathy. Without money, she couldn't continue to live there, even though the girl begged hard. This was a harsh world, and pity couldn't keep her alive. So Mary wandered alone in the dark night. When a man took the initiative to accost her, she tried hard to refuse his advances, but when she calmed down, she realized that this might be her only way to survive. In this way, Mary degenerated into a street prostitute, struggling to survive in degradation time and time again. But even such a miserable woman was still exploited by some unscrupulous people who refused to pay. However, Mary's cursing on the street caught the attention of a noble lady, who invited Mary to her room to have some food. So Mary got a rare meal with the lady's help. But in fact, this kind woman had an ulterior motive. She wanted Mary to join their brothel. But Mary, trying to receive a client for the first time, was arranged by the madam to serve a man with a face full of pimples. Mary firmly refused, but in this place, she had to obey. She even received a fierce slap from the madam, but Mary was by nature a stubborn girl. She pushed the madam aside, then ran away frantically without even getting dressed properly. But after leaving the brothel, where else could Mary go? On the quiet, dark street, the sleeping Mary was suddenly robbed by a man. How could a poor homeless woman have any money on her? So Mary tried to offer her body in exchange for her life. But at this critical moment, Mary saw the man's face clearly. It was Bob, the one who had caused her to be fired. They had messed around in the employer's laundry room, which led to Mary being dismissed from her maid job. This made Bob feel somewhat guilty, so he introduced someone to Mary Solomon, a famous fence in London's East End who made a living by buying and selling stolen goods, and who just happened to be short of an accountant to manage the stolen money. Mary was good at using the abacus to sort out accounts for others, so she didn't hesitate to knock on the door. At first, Solomon was wary. After all, he was engaged in illegal activities. But when he heard that the woman was introduced by Bob, he invited her into the house first. Mary immediately showed her abacus and promised to sort out the accounts for him in the future, asking only for a place to stay. However, Solomon didn't believe that a girl could sort out accounts, and even mocked Mary. Seeing that he didn't trust her, Mary asked him to give her a test, but Solomon noticed her scarred hands. Even though he knew the girl had gone through unimaginable hardships, it wasn't enough to let her stay. After all, this place was not a shelter. But the man, seeing that Mary was quite pretty, made an outrageous request for her to lift her skirt. To his surprise, the girl actually did it, just to survive. This was beyond Solomon's expectation, so he let down his guard and decided to test whether Mary had real skills. A series of complex problems were presented, and the girl's abacus clicked loudly. But as soon as the man finished stating the problem, Mary miraculously gave the answer. When Solomon checked the calculation in detail, it turned out that the girl's result was correct. He never thought that such a small abacus could be so powerful, and the man kept his promise, deciding to give her a job, but it was to work in his wife's brothel. It turned out that this man was related to the madam Mary had met before. Mary felt cheated. She pushed Solomon hard and tried to leave this place of trouble immediately, but the man's painful cry made her stop in her tracks. She saw blood-stained glass shards being pulled out from behind him. Mary felt a little guilty for her recklessness, so she told Solomon to lie on the table, then took off his pants and pulled out the bloodied shards one by one from his body. From this moment on, Solomon changed his attitude towards Mary, sincerely accepting this kind-hearted girl. In the days that followed, they became inseparable partners and gradually grew into intimate lovers. Even though she knew Solomon had a domineering wife, Mary was still willing to be the woman behind him. In fact, Solomon's marriage had long been a sham. Even though he dined with his family on time, his relationship with his wife was just an act in front of their children. Even the important safe at home had two different combination locks. What the husband knew, the wife didn't, and vice versa. Only when both entered their codes could they access the money inside. As time passed, with Mary's help, Solomon's business thrived, making his place a hub for London's thieves. Their relationship also deepened. To thank Mary for her hard work during this time, Solomon decided to let her run a brothel of her own. After all, Mary was familiar with this business, and who wouldn't want their assets to grow? Thus, another famous establishment opened in London, attracting many gentlemen and nobles. Mary rightfully became the madam, and Solomon even regarded her as a noble who could help him reach greater heights. But neither of them knew that a pair of jealous eyes were secretly watching them from outside. It turned out that Bob was a spy planted by Solomon's wife. Now, he had told her all about their affair. Hannah not only hated Mary for stealing her business but also for taking her husband. Even though her marriage to her husband had long been over, she would never allow anything that harmed her interests. So Hannah went to the police station and secretly handed a letter to the sheriff, reporting her husband's illegal activities. The sheriff was puzzled. They seemed like an enviable couple to others, so why would she turn against her husband and report him? But Hannah's next action showed that she had long since cut ties with Solomon. Early the next morning, the sleeping Mary was woken by a commotion. A large group of police officers had raided the brothel, finding account records and the only staff member inside. Mary tried to escape in the chaos but was caught by the police. At the same time, Solomon, who was in hiding, was also arrested. The man was taken to prison, where he reunited with his beloved. No amount of apologies could make up for the harm done to Mary, but she didn't blame him after all. This was the path she had chosen. Soon came the day of Solomon's trial. Since the court was far away, on the way, the man lied that he was a bit hungry and wanted to buy some food for the accompanying police officers. To his surprise, they agreed. In fact, this was Solomon's escape plan. He had already bribed the older policeman beside him, taking advantage of his colleague's trip to the toilet. The older officer quietly unlocked Solomon's handcuffs, and then Solomon got into a prearranged carriage. But Mary was not so lucky. For helping a criminal with his illegal activities, she was sentenced to deportation to Van Diemen's Land, a place even devils dared not easily set foot in. At the same time, Hannah, walking leisurely on the street, was suddenly dragged into a carriage by her husband. Solomon had no time to argue with Hannah. He just wanted to get his share of the money from the safe. But Hannah refused. It turned out Solomon wanted to flee to America as soon as possible, but he couldn't get his hands on the money in the safe. So, in a rage, he kicked his wife off the carriage. Yet without her husband's code, Mary couldn't open that damned safe either. Meanwhile, their son was keeping watch for his mother when he suddenly heard footsteps on the floor. To his surprise, it was Bob, Hannah's spy. The man was sneaking around and slipped something into the kettle. When Hannah came up from the basement, her son told her that Bob had been there. Just as the woman looked confused, two police officers burst in, as if on a mission, and directly found a gold watch in the kettle. This item was the stolen watch from before. And Hannah, being Solomon's wife, the fence only made things worse. Clearly, no amount of explanation from the woman could sway the judge's verdict. Like poor Mary, Hannah was also deported. Everything was over, and as Hannah was about to be taken away, she saw Bob, who looked triumphant. The female prisoners were exiled to a small island in Australia. The entire island had no cells because it was a massive prison itself. You could only enter, never leave. Escaping was harder than climbing to heaven. Mary, clutching her abacus, was among them. Soon, the female prisoners began working on the island, digging potatoes non-stop every day. This caused Mary's injured hands to flare up again. Even a moment's pause would draw the overseer's scolding. The daily routine of following rules became an inescapable shackle for Mary. Yet when she returned to the dormitory to check her hand's condition, a cursing woman suddenly bumped into her. It turned out a drunk soldier was trying to harass the woman. No matter how she begged, it seemed useless. He even dragged her away forcefully. Mary stepped forward with her abacus, knocked the man down, and helped the woman throw the soldier out the door. After this incident, the elderly prisoner gained new respect for Mary, who had bravely offered help. They became friends who could talk about anything, and the older woman told Mary many stories from the past, including a lush mountain not far away, with clean, clear springs and good soil. If they could grow potatoes there, she said, the taste would be completely different from those grown elsewhere. At the same time, the woman told Mary a secret. Whiskey could actually be made from potatoes, and it tasted smoother than that made from wheat. If they could brew whiskey from potatoes grown in the mountain soil, they might become the first rich people in the Australian colonies. Even though Mary was a prisoner now, those words burned into her heart. But fate took another turn. Hannah, Mary's rival from London, was also deported to Van Diemen's Land. Yet unlike the other prisoners, she was assigned to work as a maid in a gentleman's household. Hannah expressed confusion about this arrangement, but faced with the officer's annoyed attitude, the gentleman quickly told her to be patient, saying he'd explain once they got home. Meanwhile, Mary was in the neighboring yard, figuring out how to survive here. She even took the initiative to approach the island's merchants, using her abacus to draft accounts, showing them that growing flowers could be profitable. In fact, this was just Mary's first step toward connecting with the upper-class nobles. Here, Hannah arrived at the gentleman's house with her children, 4 people in total. big and small, leaving even the lady of the house looking puzzled. But the real reason the gentleman took Hannah in was that her husband, far away in New York, had ordered it. Perhaps a trace of old affection remained, especially with 3 underage children involved. So her husband had bribed officials and the gentleman to let his wife avoid heavy manual labor. It seemed that even after Hannah had ruined him, Solomon still held onto some lingering feelings. But the gentleman next to her wasn't useless. He told Hannah he had a position in the inspection department, which immediately piqued her interest, for she had long wanted to get back at Mary. A week later, because Mary worked hard at growing flowers and won the merchant's favor, she earned parole from the officials and formally escaped physical labor. On the other side, Hannah's life was comfortable too. Though a maid, she had the gentleman's wife doing housework while she lived a life of ease. Yet just then, the gentleman returned home dejectedly. Seeing how close he and Hannah had grown, his wife was filled with displeasure. Hannah wanted the gentleman to get back at Mary, but Mary was now outside the authorities' jurisdiction, helping the merchant run a shop, so the gentleman could do nothing for the moment. As Hannah seethed with resentment, a familiar figure appeared in the distance. The woman never expected her husband Solomon to be in Australia too. Hannah was instantly shocked. Solomon was supposed to have fled to New York. How could he be here?
Well, when I heard of your misfortune, I called the first available ship out of Boston.
Why?
The wife didn't believe her husband's lies. In her eyes, Solomon had come for 2 things: the money and the safe. And to see his beloved Mary, it was as if Hannah had hit the nail on the head. The husband was left speechless, but the wife would never allow them to flaunt their love right under her nose. To get rid of this thorn in her side, she told the gentleman all of Solomon's crimes. The gentleman didn't hesitate. He turned around and reported it to the authorities. At home, Solomon grew restless. His wife wouldn't say another word to him, making the man immediately sense something was wrong. He left the troubled place without hesitation. After asking around on the street, Solomon found where Mary was. It all happened so suddenly. The man had kept his promise. He still loved Mary deeply, but just as the woman stepped forward, excited to hug him, several soldiers emerged from behind, dragging the struggling Solomon out of Mary's sight. She wondered if they'd ever meet again in this life. All she could do was clutch the necklace Solomon had given her, unable to let go for a long time. A few days later, the man was sent to the mines, where he and other prisoners would endure a hellish existence. What would happen next? The wife was shocked to find her husband holding hands with their maid in broad daylight. She couldn't stand it, stepping forward to drag her husband away. But the man defended Hannah, saying a widow with 3 children had it really hard. But this kind of behavior, which undermines family harmony, the wife would never tolerate. She even threatened to fire the brazen woman on the spot. Yet as she dragged her husband to leave, Hannah angrily blocked her. As a parolee, she'd spent a lot of money to get this maid job in their household. Now, just because the lady said so, she was to be fired. Where would she and her 3 children go? Hannah's frantic grabbing earned her a slap from the lady. In the scuffle, Hannah pushed the lady to the ground, unaware that their fight was spotted by a patrol officer. The lady cried on the ground, accusing Hannah, who, as an exiled prisoner, saw her good days come to an end. Her 3 children were taken from her completely. Instead of cherishing her rare good fortune, Hannah was sent to the cotton mill, where she, like the other female prisoners, faced endless work every day. In contrast, her rival Mary, who she'd obsessed over ruining, lived a completely different life. Mary sold flowers for the merchant, earning huge profits. Pleased, the merchant secured her a position in the secretarial department, a reward for her hard work, and an unprecedented stroke of luck for an exiled female prisoner. But Mary politely declined the kind offer. She didn't want to leave the flower business she'd worked so hard to build, leaving the merchant confused. After all, such a life-changing opportunity didn't come to everyone. But Mary had another heartfelt wish. She wanted to use her knowledge to teach the children brought over by the prisoners. The merchant thought those children were too stupid to be educated. Mary said she'd once been a stupid child too, but her father and his friends had given her books to study. She added that teaching the children wouldn't interfere with her business management. It was hard to reject such a kind woman. After thinking it over, the merchant decided to give her a chance to teach at the prisoners' children's boarding school. But things weren't as simple as expected. The school's priest flatly refused Mary, arguing that an exiled prisoner couldn't possibly do good for criminals' offspring. It was unheard of, and even blasphemous in his eyes. Mary said she was willing to reform, willing to repent for her mistakes. The priest then told her to kneel before her faith, asking her to show sincere repentance, and in return, he'd give her a chance at redemption. So the priest led her before the poor children, and she officially became a teacher at the boarding school. To her surprise, Hannah's 3 children were among them, but kind-hearted Mary would never visit the sins of the parents on the innocent children. Besides, these were the descendants of the man she loved. Meanwhile, when Hannah received a letter from her children, her reaction was completely different. She angrily swept everything off the table. The scene shifts. Poor Solomon was enduring hard labor. 2 women had been exiled to Australia because of him. Now, trapped in this predicament thanks to his wife, he had no choice but to face these harsh years of labor. Fortunately, he met a prisoner named Billy here. Seeing Billy eating wild fruit alone, Solomon asked to try some and was surprised by how good it tasted. Moreover, Billy took him to another spot. The boy had great survival skills in the wild, always finding unexpected food to replenish the nutrition lost from hard work. Billy caught a plump treeworm, offering Solomon a taste of this unique delicacy. The man looked stunned, but watching Billy chew it so skillfully, he hesitantly put it in his mouth. From reluctant acceptance to savoring it, the worm actually tasted quite good. Solomon thanked Billy, but kindly warned him since the boy had a stubborn streak, he'd need to go with the flow to survive. But a person's nature is hard to change. Sure enough, one day, while everyone was gathering stones on the mountain, Billy stood aside, lost in thought. No matter how the overseer ordered him, the boy refused to obey, so Billy was tied to a stake, and in front of the other prisoners, he was whipped harshly for his disobedience. Even in the face of such cruel punishment, Billy clenched his teeth, refusing to submit to his abusers. This was completely opposite to the advice Solomon had given him. A year passed. Mary, who was teaching the female prisoners to work, had an extraordinary day. Mary finally gained her freedom, completely breaking free from the shackles of an exiled prisoner. The merchant was her true benefactor, the one who'd changed her fate. So Mary's first stop was Mount Wellington. Over the years, she'd secretly saved a lot of money, something the merchant didn't know about. Preparing for the factory she planned to open, she buried the money by the stream, then took off her clothes. Like a phoenix rising from the ashes, letting the clear spring wash away the dust, she laughed from the bottom of her heart, embracing this new world. Meanwhile, Hannah, toiling in the cotton mill, finally earned parole, but the officer warned her that any illegal activity would land her back in custody immediately. A document also required her to leave Hobart, move to the new town of Norfolk, and preferably work as a maid to make a living. Before leaving, the woman first went to the boarding school. She wanted to take her 3 children with her. Luckily, Mary had taken a few days off, so the 2 fated rivals didn't meet. Thus, Hannah left with her children, heading to the new town. But some women, once exposed to opportunity, could quickly sniff out business. A well-dressed gentleman's gaze caught Hannah's attention, seductive as ever. She knew what it meant. After all, she had 3 hungry children to feed. What followed came naturally. The woman used her body to gain his trust, successfully securing a way to survive. The scene shifts again. Mary took the merchant to Mount Wellington. She didn't hide her plan to grow potatoes here, and to brew whiskey from them in the future. After all, the mountain had abundant natural resources, fertile soil, sweet, clear springs, with favorable weather and geography. All they needed was people. Even though Mary had regained her freedom, the label of a former female prisoner barred her from doing business, but the man in front of her could make it happen. The merchant had significant influence here, and he shared an extraordinary relationship with the colonial officials, so Mary wanted to use his name to start a factory, allowing her to focus on her career with peace of mind. At first, the merchant was somewhat opposed, but Mary's kindness had long melted his heart, leaving him no choice but to help this poor woman. With the merchant's full support, Mary's potato factory opened smoothly, and the distillery got underway at the same time. Everything seemed to be moving toward the shore of success, until a familiar figure suddenly visited. Someone slipped in behind, and she never dreamed that her lover, who had endured years of hard labor, had returned. In this moment, all of Mary's waiting and efforts felt worthwhile, but the peaceful life she yearned for was inevitably marked by unexpected gaps. One night, while passing by the street, Solomon spotted someone lying under an overpass. He hurried down to check. Tragically, the woman in front of him seemed to have lost her life. As he felt a twinge of sorrow, the liquid staining the cloth beside her made Solomon realize she might have died in childbirth. At the same time, there was a faint movement in her abdomen. The man had a bold idea. He pulled out his dagger and resolutely rolled up his sleeves. When Solomon returned home the next day, 2 cute twin babies suddenly appeared before Mary. The woman let out a gasp and quickly asked where he'd gotten them. The man immediately explained to avoid any misunderstandings. It turned out the deceased woman had been a friend of Solomon's back in London. For some reason, she'd also been exiled to Australia. and he'd stumbled upon this tragedy on the street. So he'd brought the two poor children back. Mary, ever understanding, and since they had no children of their own, immediately decided to adopt them when her husband suggested sending them to a foster home. It was an excellent choice. They resolved to adopt the two children. 10 years passed in the blink of an eye. Under Mary's careful care, the two little ones spent each day in joy, but peace was shattered when Hannah's family moved to Hobart. Hannah, Solomon's ex-wife, had once been forced to seek refuge with a wealthy gentleman along with her children due to unforeseen circumstances. Now that the children were grown, Hannah hoped the gentleman would let her son manage some of his properties, but he wasn't the boy's biological father, and besides, the boy knew nothing about business. A few sarcastic remarks left him unable to bear his stepfather's humiliation, so he stormed back to his room in anger. A few days later, Mary and her husband were settling accounts. The distillery hadn't turned a profit in a long time and was even on the verge of bankruptcy. That day, their two children, who'd been playing outside, hadn't come home for hours, leaving Mary frantic with worry. She called out, but there was no response. She decided to take people to search the mountains, but the result was the same. No trace of the two children was found anywhere on Mount Wellington. The thought was unthinkable, and Mary was instantly plunged into endless grief. Yet more trouble followed. One night, Solomon encountered an unexpected visitor, his biological son, David. Without hesitation, the boy pulled a gun on his father. Even though Solomon hadn't paid much attention to his children over the years, this was no way to treat one's own father. They walked into a nearby warehouse, and David handed his father something, a container holding a black finger. It was clear he'd imprisoned the two children. David had been unhappy living with his stepfather, so he'd taken a desperate path, hoping to gain a sense of belonging from Solomon. He knew his father had hidden a safe in London, containing all his and his mother's savings. He planned to use this despicable tactic to extract the code from his father, threatening to send a severed finger each day if he refused. Solomon wasted no time telling Mary the news, but he deliberately kept the safe secret to himself. Mary couldn't understand why he'd do this, assuming the hateful woman Hannah was behind it. She couldn't tolerate it this time and resolved to confront Hannah face to face. It was the first showdown between the two women in years. In truth, Hannah had no idea what was going on. It was all David's doing, without her knowledge. Even when Solomon arrived and placed the severed finger in front of her, the woman couldn't believe her son was capable of such a thing. At the same time, Mary noticed a flaw in the finger. The little black boy had a scar on his finger, but this one clearly didn't, so it was certain David hadn't gone that far, though he definitely kidnapped the two children. All of this stemmed from the safe's code. When Hannah laid it out, Solomon immediately tried to leave with Mary. Had things really come to this? Could he still hide the truth from his beloved? Back home, Mary seemed to doubt their loyalty to each other. They'd endured so many hardships. She'd even been exiled to this desolate island because of Solomon. Couldn't she earn an honest truth by now? In fact, Solomon hadn't told Mary about the safe because he didn't want it to plague their lives. Besides, the safe was the root of all trouble. What mattered most now was finding their children. In the days that followed, the couple, reeling from their children's disappearance, grew increasingly haggard. But fortune favors the desperate. A former fellow prisoner who'd suffered alongside Solomon suddenly appeared before them. Despite the years apart, Solomon recognized his good friend at a glance, but Billy hadn't come to reminisce. He'd heard the uproar about the missing children and happened to see a child chained by human traffickers who shared his skin color but clearly wasn't from his tribe. Wasn't this Mary's son? So the woman set off alone to the location Billy described to find her son. Solomon, in poor health, didn't go with her. Mary ventured deep into the mountains in search of her child. Looking up, she spotted a wild dog not far away. Terrified, she let out screams that caught the dog's attention. She dropped her things and fled down the mountain as fast as she could. Thankfully, after running for a while, the beast didn't chase her. She'd been in the mountains for 7 days, yet there was still no sign of her child. How could a vulnerable woman keep going? She'd drunk all her water, so she had to rely on polluted stream water, forcing herself to swallow it despite the foul stench. When tired, she'd curl up in a rocky crevice for the night, but sleep never came. The vast mountains stretched on. Where could her son have been taken? Just as Mary reached her breaking point, a horse suddenly appeared in front of her, catching her eye, and beside it was her long-lost son. But at that critical moment, a trafficker emerged from behind, restraining her and waking the sleeping child. The man pinned Mary to a rock, punched her in the face, then roughly lifted her skirt, intent on doing something vile. Luckily, Mary had brought a pistol with her. All her efforts paid off. After enduring so much, Mary finally found her poor child. But where was her other son? Meanwhile, Mary's husband's health had deteriorated since the children went missing, and he was now constantly harassed by his biological son. David, desperate for the safe's code, had grown frantic, but Solomon would never hand over his assets to this unfilial son. The disappearance of his adopted son and his biological son's unkindness proved too much for the old man, who collapsed to the floor as he entered the house. When Solomon regained consciousness, his biological daughter was by his side. His wife Mary had also returned, bringing good news: their long-lost child was safely home. It brought a glimmer of warmth to the gloomy days. As Solomon's health improved slightly, he had his friend ship the safe source of all the trouble from London to Australia. They said the assets inside could buy 10 distilleries. At the same time, his ex-wife Hannah arrived with her husband. Hannah had reported their shared assets to a lawyer, so the safe was now in government custody. It was to be opened on a specific day in the presence of officials. However, his ex-wife's unauthorized actions exacerbated Solomon's illness. At this fate-altering moment, the husband handed his adopted son the necklace he had once given Mary, the medallion she wore on which the safe's code was engraved. That night, someone couldn't contain their impatience and sneaked into the warehouse where the safe was kept. That someone was Solomon's unfilial son, David. The boy was desperate to get his hands on the wealth inside. Even though he knew his mother's part of the code, he had no idea of his father's. After several failed attempts to open the safe, the noise he made attracted the attention of the guarding police officers. Thus, David was taken away by the patrolling officers for breaking the rules. They gathered in front of the safe the next day, with lawyers and law enforcement as witnesses. Each would enter their respective codes to unlock this long-awaited moment. But to everyone's shock, when Hannah entered her code and opened the safe she dreamed of, the sight inside left everyone stunned. The once precious treasures were now gone empty. Hannah couldn't believe it. The savings she'd accumulated over half her life had vanished like a dream. Unable to bear it, she angrily left early. Then she noticed a letter inside. She tore it open in haste, and a note inside shattered her. The adopted son had taken the wealth the night before. The treasures before them were enough to ensure their family's comfort for the rest of their lives. But Solomon didn't live to enjoy it. In his final moments, before he could say goodbye to his family, he closed his eyes, ending his legendary yet troubled life. Life went on. With financial support, the distillery returned to its former bustle. Meanwhile, a carriage approaching in the distance caught Mary's eye as she worked. To her relief, her son, who'd been missing for 2 years, had been found with the merchant's help. So much hardship, so much sorrow. No one knew what the boy had endured. I'm a movie enthusiast. Please subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time.